Michael Sterling's hands trembled as he pressed them against the cold concrete wall of the parking garage. His $1,000 suit jacket torn at the shoulder. His face streaked with tears he'd been holding back for what felt like a lifetime. And when he heard the slow, deliberate footsteps echoing behind him in the empty space, he didn't turn around. He just whispered into the darkness, "Please, don't hit me. I'm already hurt." Words that came from somewhere deeper than his current predicament. Deeper than the scandal that had just stripped him of his CEO title. Deeper than the news cameras that had chased him from his own building just an hour ago. The footsteps stopped, and a gentle voice, one that carried both strength and unexpected softness, responded, "Mr. Sterling, I'm not here to hurt you." And when Michael finally turned around, his red-rimmed eyes went wide with recognition, and then immediately filled with something that looked like terror mixed with shame. Because standing there under the flickering fluorescent light was James Morrison, a face Michael had tried to forget for 7 long years. The single father he'd fired without mercy during the company's restructuring. The man whose pleading eyes he'd ignored when he begged for just one more chance because his daughter needed her medication. The employee whose personnel file Michael had personally flagged to ensure he'd never work in the industry. Again now, here he was. Not in the expensive business clothes, Michael remembered, but in the simple uniform of the parking garage's night security, his dark skin catching the harsh light, his eyes carrying a weight of years that had passed between that terrible day and this moment. Michael's legs nearly gave out as he slid further down the wall, his voice breaking as he said, "I know what I did to you. I know I destroyed your life, and I know I deserve whatever you're going to do. But I'm telling you, James, I've lost everything: my position, my reputation, my family left me. The board voted me out. The media is calling me a fraud, and I'm already broken, okay? I'm already paying for everything I've ever done." And he covered his face with his hands. This man who'd once commanded boardrooms with an iron will, now crumbling like a child in front of the person he'd wronged most. James stood silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was processing something difficult. And then he did something Michael never expected. He walked closer, slowly, carefully, and lowered himself to sit on the ground beside this broken executive, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough that Michael could hear the exhale of breath, the settling of a man who'd clearly fought his own battles and come out the other side with something that looked remarkably like peace. "Mr. Sterling," James began, his voice measured and calm, "7 years ago, when you fired me, I went home to my 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, and I had to tell her that Daddy lost his job, and I had to watch her little face try to understand why that meant we might lose our apartment, why her medicine might not come on time, why everything was falling apart." And Michael flinched at each word, his shoulders shaking, but James continued, "I was angry at you for a long time, angry at the world, really, because being a single father is hard enough without someone making it impossible. And you didn't just fire me, you made sure I couldn't get hired anywhere else in our field. And for months I struggled, working 3 part-time jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, trying to keep my daughter fed and safe, and believing that the world was still a good place even when her daddy was drowning." Michael's voice was barely a whisper when he said, "I'm so sorry, James, I'm so sorry. I was ruthless. I was only thinking about the bottom line, about shareholder value, about my own advancement, and I didn't see you as a person. I didn't see that you had a child depending on you. I just saw numbers on a spreadsheet, and God forgive me, I've become exactly what I deserve to be: nothing." But James held up a hand, a small gesture that somehow commanded attention, even in this dim, quiet space. "Let me finish," James said, not unkindly, "because what I need to tell you is this. Losing that job, as terrible as it was, as much as it hurt and scared me, it became the thing that saved my life." And Michael's head lifted slightly, confusion crossing his face through the tears. "I had been climbing the corporate ladder just like you, Mr. Sterling, leaving my daughter with babysitters, 12 hours a day, missing her recitals and bed, telling myself it was all for her future, all to give her a better life. But really, I was chasing the same empty success that I can see now has left you here on this garage floor. And there was no judgment in his voice, just a steady truthfulness that cut deeper than any accusation could have. James looked up at the concrete ceiling, as if seeing through it to something beyond, and continued, "After you fired me, and I couldn't get another corporate job, I had no choice but to take whatever work I could find, and that's when I started working security. Night shifts mostly, which meant I had to figure out my days differently. And you know what happened? I started actually being there when Zoe woke up. I made her breakfast. I walked her to school. I picked her up in the afternoons. I helped with homework. I heard about her day. I met her friends. I became her father in all the ways that matter, not just the guy who paid the bills." And his voice grew stronger, filled with something that sounded like gratitude mixed with hard-won wisdom. "She's 13 now, Mr. Sterling, and she's thriving, straight A's, soccer team captain. But more than that, she's kind and confident, and we have a relationship built on real time together. Real presence. And I realized about 3 years ago that if you hadn't fired me, I would have missed her entire childhood chasing a title that wouldn't have loved me back." The words hung in the air between them, and Michael found himself listening with an intensity he hadn't brought to anything in years, his breathing steadying slightly as James went on. "Don't misunderstand me, those first months were hell, and the way you did it was cruel, and I'm not saying the cruelty was okay, but I am saying that sometimes our worst moments redirect us toward our best life, and I had to go through that fire to understand what actually mattered. And now I work security at 3 different buildings. I make enough to support us. I have benefits. I have time with my daughter, and I have peace. Mr. Sterling, real peace. The kind you can't buy or negotiate, or put in an annual report." And he turned to look directly at the broken man beside him. "So when I saw you on the news today, saw them tearing you apart for the financial decisions you made, for the corners you cut, for the people you stepped on, I didn't feel satisfaction or revenge. I felt sad, because I recognized the look in your eyes. The emptiness of a man who built everything on sand and is watching it wash away." Michael was openly weeping now, not the silent tears from before, but deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from years of pressure finally releasing, and between gasps, he managed to say, "I have 3 children who won't speak to me, James. 3 kids who grew up with a father who was always at the office, or on his phone, or too tired to care. And my oldest son told me last month that he doesn't even really know who I am, that I'm just the guy who paid for things and showed up to take pictures at graduations. And my wife left because she said she'd been lonely in our marriage for 15 years. And the worst part is, I can't even argue with any of them, because they're right. They're all right. I gave everything to a company that just voted me out in under 20 minutes. And I don't know who I am without the title, without the corner office, without the validation of success. And I'm scared, James. I'm terrified, because for the first time in my adult life, I have to face the fact that I've wasted it. I've absolutely wasted the one life I get on Earth." The parking garage seemed to hold its breath around them. These 2 men from completely different worlds, sitting side by side on cold concrete. One in a torn designer suit, and one in a security uniform, both carrying wounds that money could never heal. And James let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "You haven't wasted all of it. Mr. Sterling, you've wasted a lot, yes, but you're still breathing, which means you still have time to become someone different, someone better. And I'm telling you this not because you deserve my kindness, but because my daughter taught me something that changed how I see everything." Michael turned to look at him, his face a mess of tears and running mascara from where his wife had hugged him that morning before she knew what was coming. And James continued, "When Zoe was 8, She came home from school crying because she'd accidentally broken another kid's art project, and she was terrified of facing this kid the next day. And I told her, "Baby girl, when you hurt someone, you can't undo it, but you can own it. Apologize from your heart, and then show them through your actions that you're different now." And she did. And you know what? That kid became her best friend, because there's something powerful about genuine change, about someone humble enough to admit they were wrong and brave enough to become better. And he paused, letting the implication settle. "You can't get back the years, Mr. Sterling. You can't undo the damage to me, or to however many other people you treated as disposable. But you can own it, really own it. Not just say sorry, but actually become a different kind of man. And you can start today, right here on this garage floor." Michael's voice was hoarse when he asked, "How? How do I even begin to fix this kind of damage? How do I become someone worth knowing after being someone so terrible for so long?" And there was genuine desperation in the question. The plea of a man who'd just had his entire identity, structure collapse and didn't know how to build anything real in its place. James stood up slowly, his knees cracking, slightly evidence of long shifts on his feet tanned. He extended his hand down to Michael, who stared at it as if it were the most precious thing he'd ever been offered. And when he finally took it, James pulled him to his feet with surprising strength, steadying him when he wobbled slightly, and said, "You begin by showing up, actually showing up, for the people in your life. Call your kids, not to explain or defend yourself, but to listen. Really listen to their hurt and their anger and their disappointment, and you keep showing up, even when they push you away at first. Because rebuilding trust takes time and consistency, not grand gestures." And Michael nodded, really hearing it, and James continued, "And you figure out who you are, without the title. Take the security job if you have to. Take the humbling work. Learn what it's like to live in the world you used to look down on. Meet people who measure success differently. Volunteer somewhere that you're nobody special, just another pair of hands helping, and slowly, bit by bit, you build a life based on who you are, not what you achieve." They stood there facing each other, and Michael said, with more honesty than he'd offered anyone in decades, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, James, and I'm not asking for it. But I want you to know that what you've given me tonight, this conversation, this perspective, this mercy, I absolutely don't deserve. It's the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me, and I swear to you, I'm going to spend whatever time I have left becoming someone worthy of this second chance." And James nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips for the first time. "I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Sterling. I'm doing this because Zoe is watching how her daddy moves through the world, and I want her to see that we help people even when they've hurt us, that we offer truth even when it's easier to offer revenge, that we believe people can change because we're all still changing, all still learning, all still growing toward the people we're meant to be." Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, and James immediately shook his head. But Michael said quickly, "No, please. I'm not trying to pay you off or insult. Why? Just want to give you something." And he pulled out a small, worn photograph that looked like it had been carried for years, and it showed a much younger Michael, maybe in his 20s, holding a tiny baby, and his face in the photo was lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy. "This is me with my oldest son, Jake, the day he was born. And I look at this sometimes and wonder where that guy went, the one who was so amazed and grateful just to be a father, and I think I've been grieving him for years without realizing it." And he held it out to James. "I want you to keep this, and if you ever see me in the news again, or hear my name somewhere, I want you to look at it and remember that somewhere inside the ruthless CEO was a man who once knew how to love something more than himself. And I'm going to find him again. I'm going to become him again, I promise." James took the photo carefully, studied it for a long moment, and then tucked it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, and said, "I'll keep this. and I'll pray for you. Mr. Sterling, I'll pray that you find your way back to this man, and that your children get to meet him while there's still time. And the simple sincerity of it broke something else open in Michael, but this breaking felt different, felt like the cracking of a shell rather than the shattering of glass, felt like something new might actually be able to grow from this rubble. As James turned to continue his security rounds, Michael called out, "Wait, can I ask you one more thing?" And James paused, turning back with patient eyes, and Michael said, "Your daughter, Zoe, would she ever, maybe someday, would she let me apologize to her too? Because if my actions hurt you, they hurt her, and she deserves to hear that I'm sorry from the man who caused her father so much pain." And James considered this carefully before responding. Not yet. She's at an age where she's figuring out justice and fairness and how the world works, and I need to be careful about what I expose her to. But maybe someday, if you do the work, if you really become someone different, maybe there will be a time when that conversation would be healing rather than harmful. And if that time comes, I'll know it, and I'll reach out. And Michael nodded, understanding that even this was more grace than he deserved, more hope than he'd had any right to expect when he'd pressed himself against that wall, expecting punishment. They shook hands then, a real handshake, firm and meaningful, and James said, "You know where to find my work this garage Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights. And I'm not your guru or your therapist or your absolution, but if you need someone to be honest with you while you're figuring this out, someone who's been on the other side of your decisions and lived to tell about it, I'll listen." And Michael's voice cracked as he said, "Thank you, James. Thank you for being a better man than I ever was, for showing me what strength actually looks like, for being exactly what I needed when I deserved it least." And James just smiled, a smile that held both sadness for what had been lost and hope for what might still be possible, and said, "We're all just trying to find our way home. Mr. Sterling, you've just taken a longer detour than most, but the path is still there if you're brave enough to walk it." As James disappeared into the shadows of the garage, his footsteps echoing away into silence, Michael stood alone in that pool of flickering light. But he didn't feel alone. He felt witnessed. He felt seen in his brokenness and somehow not rejected. And he pulled out his phone with shaking hands and scrolled to his oldest son's number, a number he'd called so rarely that his son probably wouldn't even answer. And he took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to a God he'd ignored for decades, and pressed call. And when it went to voicemail, as he expected, he said, "Jake, it's Dad, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, especially after everything you've seen on the news today. But I'm calling because I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. You were right. About all of it. About me not being present. About me prioritizing everything else over you and your siblings. About me being a father in name only, and I can't change the past, son. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the father you deserved to have all along. And I'm not asking you to forgive me, or trust me, or even call me back. I'm just telling you that I'm here, really here, maybe for the first time in your life. And whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be waiting, because being your dad is the most important title I ever had. And I'm so sorry it took losing everything else to realize it." He sent similar messages to his other 2 children, and then he called his ex-wife, not to beg her to come back, but to apologize for the loneliness he'd caused, for the partnership he'd failed to honor, for the years she'd carried the emotional weight of their family alone while he chased his empty ambitions. And she listened in shocked silence before saying softly, "Michael, I don't know if you can really change, but I hope you can, not for me, but for those kids who still need a father, even at their age, and for yourself. Because the man I married had a good heart before the world convinced him that having a good heart was a weakness." And they talked for an hour, really talked, and while it didn't fix anything, it felt like the first honest conversation they'd had in a decade. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most humbling of Michael's life, He sold his penthouse and most of his possessions to pay back the people his decisions had harmed. He took a job as a business consultant for non-profits at a fraction of his old salary. He started volunteering at a youth center in an underserved neighborhood, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night, he'd stop by that parking garage, and sometimes James would have a few minutes to talk, and sometimes he'd just nod in acknowledgement. But the consistency mattered. The showing up mattered, and slowly, very slowly, Michael began to understand what it meant to build a life on substance rather than status. His children were cautious at first, testing whether this change was real or another performance. But when months went by and Michael kept showing up to his daughter's volleyball games, to family dinners where he listened more than he spoke, to his youngest son's college orientation as a present and engaged father rather than a distracted executive on his phone, they began to soften, began to let him in, and the day his oldest son, Jake, called him just to talk about nothing in particular, just to share his day, Michael sat in his small apartment and wept with gratitude for a gift he'd never thought he'd receive. 2 years after that night, in the parking garage, Michael was at the youth center, helping a group of teenagers prepare for job interviews, when James walked in with a beautiful, confident young woman who had his eyes and his gentle smile, and Michael's heart stopped because he knew immediately who she was. And James said, "Mr. Sterling, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Zoe. She's volunteering here for her school's community service requirement. And when I told her this was where you worked, she said she wanted to meet you." And Zoe extended her hand with poise beyond her 15 years and said, "My dad told me what happened between you two, all of it. And he also told me about how you've changed, how you've been working to become better. And I just wanted to say that I think it's brave to admit when you're wrong and actually do something about it. And I'm glad my dad helped you find your way, because helping people is what he does best." Michael shook her hand carefully, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide, and said, "Zoe, I owe your father more than I can ever repay, and I owe you an apology. Too, my actions hurt your family, made your life harder, and I'm deeply sorry for that. And I want you to know that the lessons your father taught me, the grace he showed me when I deserved it least, it changed everything. It saved me in ways I'm still discovering." And Zoe smiled, a smile full of her father's kindness, and said, "My dad always says that people are more than their worst moments, and that everyone deserves a chance to grow. I guess you're proof that he's right." And the three of them stood there together, this unlikely constellation of people brought together by pain and transformed by mercy. And Michael thought about how 2 years ago he'd been pressed against a wall in a dark parking garage expecting punishment. And now he was standing in a bright community center, surrounded by purpose and second chances, and the kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. As Michael drove home that evening, past the gleaming office building where he used to work, where someone else now sat in his old corner office, chasing the same empty victories he'd once prized, he didn't feel envy or regret. He felt free. He felt alive. He felt like the man in that photograph he'd given James, the one holding his newborn son with eyes full of wonder. And he realized that being broken in that parking garage was the best thing that ever happened to him. That James Morrison had given him something infinitely more valuable than mercy or forgiveness. He'd given him a mirror that showed the truth, and a map that led back to himself, and a living example that the measure of a man isn't found in his titles or his bank account or his reputation, but in how he treats people when there's nothing to gain, how he shows up for the ones he loves, how he transforms his pain into purpose and his second chances into service, and most of all, how he understands that being hurt doesn't give us permission to hurt others, but being helped, truly helped by someone we've wronged, that gives us a responsibility to pay forward that grace, to become the kind of person who lifts others up instead of stepping on them to climb higher, to build a legacy not of success but of significance, not of achievement but of authentic love. and as Michael pulled into the parking lot of his modest apartment complex, he saw a message from Jake asking if he wanted to grab breakfast in the morning, just the two of them. And he sat there in his car with his hands on the steering wheel and whispered, "Thank you, James. Thank you for not hitting me when I was already hurt, but for sitting beside me and showing me how to heal." And he meant it with every fiber of his being. This man who'd lost everything only to discover that everything he'd lost was nothing compared to everything he'd found. And the lesson he carried forward from that night in the garage was the one he now tried to live every single day. That we are all just broken people bumping into each other in the dark, and the choice to offer light instead of more darkness. To offer truth wrapped in compassion instead of punishment wrapped in justice. To offer hope that people can change because we ourselves are still changing that choice. Made over and over again, in small moments that nobody sees, and big moments that everybody watches. That is the choice that makes us human, that makes us whole, that makes our lives mean something beyond ourselves, and that transforms our deepest wounds into our greatest wisdom, our worst failures into our most profound teachers, and our most painful encounters into the sacred moments that save us from the prisons we've built around our own hearts.